And we are recording.
We are recording. Thank you, Karen. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jersey Friendly Yards 2020 webinar series. As we all know, in the current situation we're all going through with the COVID pandemic, we normally have an annual conference in October, but we've decided to move it online for safety's sake to a series of webinars. So we are pleased to have our talk tonight from Mike Haberland, who will be talking about the buzz with bees. He'll be talking about native and manage pollinators. Just a couple of housekeeping rules that are out there. Everybody who is participating tonight, except for obviously myself, if you can hear me, is muted and has their video off on as soon as they enter the webinar. So in order to communicate with us, the best way to do that and to ask questions is to use the chat feature. If you have not used WebEx before, the chat feature is if you move your mouse or your guide on the device that you're using, at the bottom of the screen, you should see a series of circles. And within one of those circles will look like one of those cartoon talking bubbles that you would fill in with somebody's words. So you click on that, and once it's highlighted, you should see chat come up on the right, or on your phone, it should pop up. And you should be able to type in a question or just let us know where you're from or what county you're in, just to let us know that you're here, or even just to say hi, that would be great. But definitely to ask any questions. If you're going to ask any questions, please make sure that you set the chat to go out to everyone or all participants, just so that we are able to see the question and can ask the presenter the question at the right time, except when we can. So please, that's how we're going to be handling questions. We are recording this presentation tonight. So thank you, Mike, for letting us record your presentation. And it will be available through the Jersey Friendly Yards website after this. And you will probably get a quick link to it as a registrant afterwards. In addition to the webinar tonight, when it is over, you will get an email with a link to answer some questions. So it's just a follow-up survey with just a few questions to let us know what you thought of tonight's presentation, how you think the webinar series is going, etc. So please be on the lookout for that, and please fill that out when you get the chance. We are here for Jersey Friendly Yards. I will introduce myself. My name is Steve Yorjo. I'm the county agent for Ocean and Atlantic counties with Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and also an associate professor in agriculture and natural resources at Rutgers University. And I work in partnership with the creators of Jersey Friendly Yards, the Barnegat Bay Partnership. And we do have Karen Waltzer, who's the outreach coordinator and education coordinator for that. And also we do it in conjunction with the Ocean County Soil Conservation District, and Becky LeBoy and Christine Rabe, the director of the Soil Conservation District, has worked tirelessly to get the Jersey Friendly Yards program up and running. So part of what we do with Jersey Friendly Yards is talk about sustainable environmental landscaping, and each year we do a conference. This year we stayed with the theme, even though we canceled the conference and moved it to online. So we are wild about our Jersey Friendly Yards. So we are talking all about wildlife. So native wildlife, sometimes problematic wildlife. Our next talk, we'll be talking about planting native plants and what can be deer resistant. But tonight we are talking about pollinators. So we're talking about native bees and honeybees. And so we have Mike Haberland, who is the county agent with Burlington and Camden counties with Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and also an associate professor in agriculture and natural resources. And Mike's background and research focus is on a lot of watershed management and restoration programs, but he also teaches an undergraduate apiary class. So he is our resident bee expert. So here's my bad joke, and I say I'm so glad you could all be here with us tonight. So we appreciate you taking the time, especially for those who are rolling with the punches in terms of the rescheduling of tonight's talk from last week. So now that I've done a quick introduction for Mike, we are excited to have him talk to us about bees and other pollinators. So take it away, Mike, and thank you for doing this.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, and everyone else with the Jersey Friendly Yards program. I'm pleased to be here tonight. I'm glad that at least in my area, it's not storming, and that everyone who's joining us was able to do so after last week's postponement. So today we're going to talk about bees, native bees, and our one non-resident honeybee. But we're also going to talk, I was asked to throw in some other items on it. So this is going to be a bee talk with ecology involved. But so let's start out with the importance of pollinators because that's what the bees are. And for humans, bees are very important. They pollinate 35% of the global crops around the world. And if you look at that number, a phenomenal number, they're worth up to $500 billion of value from their pollination services and the things they provide. Look at the list of things that we get from them. Besides food, vitamins, micronutrients, fibers, medicines, technology, a tremendous amount of things. But that's for humans. How about the ecosystem itself, which depends on the pollinators? So about 85% of the total world's flowering plants need pollination by insects or by critters, not necessarily all insects. And pollination by other organisms helps promote diversity because they're not monocultured crops. The genetics get spread around, and pollinators create a variety of support in the landscape. So the fruits and seeds that result from pollination are the diet of 25% of birds and many of the mammals. And also the pollinators themselves, they do all these services that help the plants, but they also are eaten and they provide protein and food for a lot of wildlife, especially birds. So they're very important for a number of reasons. A quick look, if anybody's not familiar with pollination and what we're talking about tonight. So we're talking about the movement of the male pollen over to the female stigma of a plant. And that's how pollination occurs. And usually it's an insect, although pollination can be by wind or just plain old gravity, the pollen falling to and landing on a female plant flower underneath it. Typically you have, we're going to use, tonight we're focusing on insects, so we're going to say we're using an insect. It runs around in one flower, gets pollen on it, moves to another flower looking for nectar, and accidentally rubs some of that pollen off on the female stigma and helps to pollinate that plant. If you look down in the bottom left, that is my backyard. That's a pumpkin plant that is doing amazingly well right outside the back door. And early in the morning, about 6:30 in the morning when this picture was taken, the flowers are open. So the flowers open late at night, and by 10 a.m. in the morning, they've closed up and faded away. But if you get up early, you can see this is a native bee inside collecting pollen off the male stamen. So for humans, is pollen, what happens if we lose all the bees? That's a question that you'll see in the newspaper. What about, the bees are in decline. What happens if we lose all the bees? Humans are going to starve. Well, they're not going to starve because corn, wheat, rice, soybeans, there are a lot of plants that are either self-pollinated or wind-pollinated. However, what we would lose is all the good stuff, the things that are really tasty. Our fruits and most of our vegetables are pollinated by insects. And so when you think about it, that's our real loss, is the diversity in our food source. And I kind of like the diversity that we have, especially now that it's summer and all these good things are available for us to eat. If you haven't seen this before, I think this is pretty interesting. In 2016, Whole Foods Market did this little program to show what their store was like with and without pollinators. So here's their produce section. They're on a normal day with all the animal pollinated products that they would have. And then here we look at what it would be like if those products weren't there. So while we're not going to starve, the diversity of products that we would be able to eat is hugely different. So there's a big concern for our pollinators because there's a loss of pollinators worldwide. 40% of invertebrate pollinators are facing extinction, and that is mainly in the bees and butterfly area. Things that are attributing that are changes in land use, land that's being taken out of fields and forests and natural areas and put in and developed, by humans or for buildings or agriculture. And here we have agriculture intensification, huge plots of land that are monocultures, not the diversity or the species that bees would need to survive. And there's also, and that helps to, in these monocultures, help add to the pathogens and disease problems that can be found in the bees. Also, homeowners, turfs are monocultures. They really do nothing to support plant life or bird life. Probably the biggest benefit, the biggest critter that benefits from a lawn are Japanese beetles that feed on the roots of your lawn and then emerge and feed on all the ornamental plants in your yard and cause a lot of damage. So lawns are a huge problem. Just because the amount of irrigation, pesticides, herbicides, things that people like to put on their lawns to keep them looking like a lawn. So how can you help? So you can take some of that lawn if you're a homeowner and change it into pollinator habitat. It doesn't have to be a huge amount. You can start out with a small amount and then maybe you increase it. So if we look up in the upper right, that is outside my kitchen window. So this is a small, about 15-foot long, 8-foot wide, that used to be lawn in the backyard. And then when my son went away to college and wasn't practicing soccer anymore, we've planted that with native plants. And down in the lower left, that's a rain garden off our family room. And the thing I want to stress with calling it a rain garden, which is probably kind of not the best name for it, is that it's nothing more than a garden. It just is a place where you send water from a downspout and it has a chance to collect and soak in. And you can plant pretty much the same plants that you'd plant in a drier area, because most of the time your rain garden is going to be dry. That water's supposed to drain through. It's not supposed to be wet. It's not a bog. That's totally different type of habitat. So rain gardens, you can pretty much plant whatever you like in there. And so I wanted to show you a few of the plants that we have out in our backyard that are tremendous pollinator plants. All of these get mobbed by pollinators every summer. If you haven't, Culver's root up in the upper left, Lower left, that's milkweed. So we have two types of milkweed in the yard. In the middle is the #1 species for pollinators. Both of these are two different types of mountain mint, and they are like catnip for insects. They just get huge amounts of native bees, honeybees, all kinds of pollinators. And that pollinator up in the upper right-hand corner, so I wanted to show you, I put that in especially because right outside our kitchen window, where we have this little garden, that's Anise hyssop, and it puts up these spikes of lavender flowers. And I took this picture just this week because now it's developing seeds in the flower head, and it has attracted 3 pairs of goldfinches. So we could look out the window. We have goldfinches landing on these hyssops, which have a very thin stem. So their birds are bobbing up and down while they're picking at these seeds. So it's very entertaining. Down at the bottom right, that's bee balm. Upper left, that's asters, either New England aster or New York aster. There's also other types of asters. They're all excellent pollinator plants, and they come out later in the season, an important time for the pollinators. False sunflower in the middle up top, golden Alexanders up to the right. Sneezeweed down in the bottom left. Boy, that's another one that gets mobbed. So all of these flowers that I'm showing you, this is 12 flowers, plant types that if you put them in your yard, you're going to build up the pollinators in your yard, and they're going to love you for it. So let's see if this works. So this is right outside in my back. This is, so it's clustered mountain mint or Virginia mountain mint. It's got the broader leaf. Hopefully this won't make you seasick watching the wind kick those. But look at all the native bees that are crawling around on this plant. It's got a composite head. All these little tiny flowers keep opening up, and it will last in blooming for a good month anyway, if not longer. So it's a great plant to have in your backyard. Now this is another type of mountain mint. This is narrowleaf mountain mint. And I just want you to see, I hope this shows up for you, but there are probably 200,000 or 300,000 honeybees this day that were on these flowers. Just absolutely going crazy over this mountain mint. Also, if I zoomed up in there, also there are a lot of native bees and bumblebees that are using these as well. And if we, and also a few wasps. So mountain mint, #1 pollinator plant. So you can find out a lot about the native plants for your landscaping on the Jersey Friendly Yards website. And it has steps to create the yard. It has a place that lists where to buy plants by county. So it's very, very useful. And it also has a plant database that you can plug in the information for your location, your soil types, and it will give you a selection of plants that you can use. Another great resource is the Xerces Society. They have a whole list of plants specifically for the Mid-Atlantic region. And the nice thing, this list here, if you look, it's broken down by early, mid, late blooming. which is very handy because that's the nice thing in your yard. You want to plant a range of species so that you have plants from spring through fall. So our plants start blooming in April because we've planted some non-native daffodils because they come up when nothing else is coming up. But we start out with those. It's nice to look at. You see these daffodils ringing the edges of our gardens. And then it starts moving into the native plants, start opening up. Now everything's in bloom. And all the fall plants are opening up, and they will have asters and goldenrod and sneezeweed up probably into October. So there's a variety of pollinators, not just everyone thinks of bees and butterflies, but we also have hummingbirds. We have that American goldfinch sitting on the plant, the hyssop, going after the seeds, but spreading pollen around to other plants. Out west, they actually have bats that do pollination, something that we don't think about as a regular pollinator. So here's our butterflies that people think about. Butterflies are interesting animals in that they need different types of plants for their life cycle. So the larvae, they actually eat leaves. So they need a plant that they're adapted to for that the larvae, the caterpillars, can eat the leaves. So if we look in the bottom right, that's everybody I'm sure knows the monarch caterpillar eating the milkweed plant. And then the adult, which is right above it, doesn't eat plants. It only eats nectar. It doesn't even eat pollen. Off to our left, that caterpillar, which is supposed to look like bird poop, is a swallowtail caterpillar. And as my daughter found out, they are very much attracted to dill plants. So if you have dill and you have it outside, you may come out one day and find that your dill has been stripped and you have several caterpillars running around. Now, who would have thought flies are a huge pollinator? There are so many of them, even though they feed on decaying matter and blood and feces, they also like to get a nectar break. So there's a ton of different fly types that are pollinators just from their huge abundance going up to get some nectar. And because they also have a lot of them have little hairs on them, they can pick up pollen and take that to another flower for pollination. Beetles are one of the big pollinators. Beetles are the largest insect order. So there's a ton of different types of beetles. And we say that they complement other insect pollination because they're not finesse pollinators. They're kind of clumsy. They just kind of walk around on flowers looking for some pollen to eat. And as they're doing that, they're rubbing around, getting pollen on their bodies, moving it around. And they like to go to these flowers that really have big clusters of small flowers. So your goldenrods, your spirea, sunflowers, spice bush, and yarrows, all very popular with the beetles. So wasps and hornets, they also are pollinators, but not in the way that the bees are. So wasps and hornets are omnivorous, and the adults are only feeding on nectar. So when they come over to the plant, they want to get carbohydrates. They're looking for that nectar to give them the carbohydrate load they need just for plain old flying. But they hunt other insects. The young, the larvae of wasps and hornets are carnivorous. So the adults, while they're not meat eaters anymore, they kill a lot of insects to bring that protein back to the larvae to feed them. And honeybees are a prime target for the bald-faced hornet, which is down in your left. They'll snatch them right out of the air and snip their head off. Um, Bald-faced hornets also kill yellow jackets. So if you have a bald-faced hornet net in your nest in your yard and it's up in a tree, it's out of the way, so you're not going to be close to it, it's actually not a bad idea to let it stay there because they'll keep your yard free of yellow jackets, and then in the wintertime, they'll die off. So now we're getting to bees, which are the most important pollinator. And the big thing about bees is they're hairy, and they have these branched hairs for a lot of surface area to collect that pollen in. So I'm going to back up and we're going to look at our wasps and hornets. So wasps and hornets are much smoother. They look more shiny. They do have some rudimentary hairs on them, but they're straight and not branched. So they're not pollen collectors. However, when we look at this, you can see the face. That's a honeybee face looking at us. Look at all that hair. Look, and the pollen gets trapped in that. So here we are. Let's do a quick comparison. We have two bees down on the bottom, the honeybee and the bumblebee. Notice they're hairy. And as we look above them, we have our common hornets and wasps. And no, that is not a giant Asian hornet up in the top. That is a European hornet, which I've gotten a lot of calls on this year because we do have European hornets here, and they are very big. They are a couple of inches, but they are not aggressive like the Asian hornet. Also, if you'll notice, the head of the European hornet has the red in the face, whereas the giant Asian hornet is all yellow. And the giant Asian hornet, actually looks like its face is inflated. The head is huge. It seems like it was used as a punching bag and it swelled up. So it sort of looks a little odd, and it's all yellow. So that's a very distinctive feature of it. And so far, for anybody who's concerned about it, there still has not been any giant Asian hornets found outside of Washington or British Columbia. So the U.S. is home to a tremendous diversity of wild bees. In the U.S., 3,600 or probably more native bees, and many of them are important crop pollinators. You can see, and now in the upper left, that is a honeybee. That's a non-native bee, still a very important crop pollinator. But apples, almonds. Almonds are the #1 pollinated crop in the nation. Every year in the month of January, commercial beekeepers and the native bees themselves are busy pollinating tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of acres of pollen crops. It seems like most of the agriculture land in California is all switching over to almonds because it's such a valuable crop. For honeybees, they send 2.5, or last year it was 1.8 million beehives were sent to California on semi-trucks for the month of January for almond pollination. And the average cost for one hive for rental for the month of January was $180. So you can see 1.8 million times $180 is a lot of money. So it's very uh, lucrative crop. So let's take a look at our bees that we're going to spend the rest of the evening talking about. They're called Hymenoptera, which means membrane wing. And ants, bees, and wasps are all a member of the Hymenopteras. They have 6 legs. They're a true insect. All true insects have 6 legs. And bees have 4 wings, 2 on each side. And if you take a look at that picture, you don't see 4 wings when they're folded back. So they actually can separate the 2 wings on each side. When they go to fly, they wings pop out and they Velcro them together. They have these little hooks that run along the length of the wing. They snap together. So the 2 wings on each side are working together, gives them a better flight, a stronger flight. And then when they land and they tuck their wings in, they just unvelcro them and they tuck them over their back to protect them. So while wasps and hornets are carnivorous for part of their life cycle, bees are all totally vegetarian. They only eat pollen and nectar for all their life stages. And as they get older, bees only eat nectar. And again, as this picture shows, they are great pollinators because the pollen sticks to their feather-like hairs. Now, an interesting thing, as the bees are flying, they are building up an electric charge in their body. So it's similar to if you take a balloon and you rub it on your shirt and you stick it to the wall, you build up that static charge and it sticks to the wall. Well, when the bees land on a flower, that pollen will just kind of jump on them. It's attracted to that static charge on their body and it just kind of leaps onto their hair. So they don't have to run around and try and scoop the pollen onto their bodies. A lot of it will just naturally is attracted to them and just kind of leaps onto them. That's why they look like someone just dusted them with a powder puff of pollen. And then they'll take their legs and they'll move it around to different parts of their body to store it for the flight home. And speaking of that, so here are some structures on native bees called scopas. So most of the native bees have some type of scopa, which is a bunch of hair, a dense mat of hairs, and that's where they're going to store the pollen that they're collecting. And you can see the one in the middle, the scopa is on the underneath side of its abdomen, and the one on the right actually has the hairs on its leg. So those hairs on the one on the right are different. That's a grouping of hairs, and they are shoving the pollen into those hairs to carry them home. Now we're going to contrast that with the honeybee and bumblebees. So they have a structure called a pollen basket on their back leg. So it's a flattened portion of the tibia of the back leg, and it's surrounded by coarse hairs that are very stiff. So when the bees are collecting pollen, they collect it on their hair, and then they use their legs to move the pollen back towards the pollen basket, and they mix it with a little secretion of nectar from what they call the nectar stomach. So they have like a stomach before their main stomach, and that holds nectar in it, and they can spit a little of that out onto the pollen to moisten it. And if you looking at the pictures here, you can see it's a little shiny. It looks a little moist. That's so when the bees are flying back with their pollen load, it's not blowing away. It's all staying together. So all that effort they're putting into it, they want to make sure that pollen is there on their legs when they get back to the nest. So there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the native bees. So here we have the largest US native bee. This is the carpenter bee. And then we also have the smallest, a little solitary ground nesting bee from the Southwest. And because so many of the bees are actually pretty small, a lot of people don't even think of them as bees. They just kind of overlook them. So here we have some examples of the different types, and notice many different colors. If you look around, right in the center, that's a mason bee. That is an important crop pollinator, especially for apples, and it's one that has its scopa, its pollen collection device, on its abdomen. Down in the lower right, we have a lot of the native bees are metallic colored, either this green metallic or a blue metallic. And this one, you see it has pollen scopa on the ends of its legs, the lower portions of its legs. So a lot of variety in these. And this just shows in the center, the non-native. There are one non-native species in the US, is the European honeybee, and then all the others are native bees, all different colors, all different sizes. So a huge diversity. And also in lifestyle, not only in color and shape, but in lifestyle. How about flight periods? So the bees don't all fly all year long. The only one that has the ability to fly all year long is the European honeybee. All the other bees are annuals. They only live that year, and the colony has to redevelop in the spring of each year. But you can see different ones fly for different lengths of time. The bumblebees actually come out early, and they stay pretty much through the whole summer. Mason bees, which are a crop pollinator, and a lot of the mining bees, which are another crop pollinator, they come out in the springtime when the crop is available. And this is what their life has evolved into. They're there when their specific crop is around. They do their whole life, their reproduction, their rearing of young, while with the food that's available from that crop, and then the adults die off, and the brood are developing throughout the summer and winter and hatch out the following year. So let's talk about the different types of social behaviors of bees, because we really have two types of bees: solitary bees, which is the majority of the bee species, roughly 90%. And then we have social bees, which are bees that work together. So in the solitary bees, the queen does all the work. And we'll talk about that. And in the social bees, they have workers that help out. So if we look in the lower left, those are ground nesting bees. These are solitary bees. Each of those holes has a single queen. She digs the hole, and she makes the brood chambers. She does everything, does all the foraging by herself. And then we contrast that if we look on the right. So that's a honeybee. That's actually a starter colony called a nucleus colony. And I took that picture to show you how they work together. So this is a way of adding more bees to that hive to make it a little stronger. So you shake the frame from a strong hive off on the ground in front of that nucleus hive, and you put something for them to climb up on. And the bees that you shake out, the old foragers, they fly back to the original nest. And what you're seeing crawling up there are nurse bees. So these are the bees that'll take care of the young that are in this nucleus box. So they're not flying yet. They just, it's the neatest thing. They just seem to know, and they just crawl up the structure that you put for them, and they'll enter the hive, and they're allowed into the hive because nurse bees aren't considered a threat to the rest of the hive. So they become a part of this new hive. Let's look at the life cycle of a solitary bee. And this one we're looking at in particular is a ground nesting bee, but this life cycle is also the same for what we'll talk about later called stem nesting bees. They do this, it's the same thing, just a different location. So the adult, the queen, she digs her hole, she makes these little breeding chambers off the main channel entrance to the hive, and then she goes out foraging. She brings back nectar and pollen, makes this nectar pollen ball that she puts in to the brood chamber, and she lays her egg on top of it. The egg hatches out into a larvae, which feeds on this pollen ball throughout the summer and fall, and then over the winter, the young bee will pupate, and in the springtime, it will emerge as a young adult. So again, 70% of bees are ground nesters. So while they resemble ant nests, they tend to be larger holes, and you also don't see bees going, or ants going in and out of them. If you watch for a while, you will see bees coming back. They don't spend a lot of time. They'll fly back. They'll find their individual hole and dive down into it. They line their chambers with a waxy glandular secretion. Some of them make something that's akin to a cellophane, and both of these protect the brood from flooding. So here's a nice cross section of a solitary bee nest, and showing you the different chambers with the pollen balls and the developing larvae. So this is what it looks like underneath your lawn if you have these. So you should never panic if you have these. A lot of people are like, oh my gosh, how do I get rid of these? And let me go to this slide. So some people's yards may look like this. This happens to be a park, but I have a neighbor in my development that his yard looks like this in the month of May. And I'm sure people are like all freaked out because they're like, oh, this is terrible. But then they go dormant. They finish their life cycle. So from the beginning of June on through the rest of the year, you don't see the bees at all. So they do their thing. And you know what's nice about them is they're creating air and drainage holes into the soil in your yard. So they're actually improving the soil properties. So they actually are a good thing if you can get away and not worry that for a certain amount of time, you've got these large anthill looking things. Once the bees are gone, they're gone, and your lawn looks normal again.
Hey, Mike, it's Steve.
Yep.
Can I interrupt with a question?
Sure.
Somebody asked a question about walking on lawns that have these ground nesting bees, especially in bare feet.
Oh,
So
yeah.
they want to know about any safety issues, for
Oh,
yourself
well,
or for the nests.
yes. So I understand it's a great experience. So actually, they're called tickle bees because they don't sting you. They do have stingers. I mean, these little teeny tiny, very small stingers. They don't sting people. You would have to physically grab one in your hand and, you know, um, and and maybe it would sting you then. But these are nothing like honeybees, nothing like wasps and hornets. In Did I mention they're called tickle bees because um, some of them will land on people to collect sweat, and so they tickle your arm. And there are actually whole schools in the state of Oregon that have tickle bees as their mascot. They have big events about the tickle bees. Their fields are covered with them. The kids go out and play with them. So no, if you have native bees and they're actually bees, you have nothing to worry about. They'll stay out of your way. It's very unlikely you'd step on one. The thing about bees is they have exceptional uh, motion detection. So bees all see color except for the color red, but otherwise they see all the other colors that we see, plus they see ultraviolet light. They use that for navigation, for finding pollen sources. But the big thing is they have something called a flicker rate. So we all have flicker rates. So humans, our flicker rate is somewhere 25 to 30 frames per second. So when we look at a movie, uh, the typical cinematic movie used to always be shot at 25 frames per second. I think now it's moved up to 30 frames per second. And we see that as a smooth uh, motion. Bees would see each individual frame of that. They actually have a flicker rate between 150 and 200 frames per second. So when they're flying along at 12 to 15 miles an hour, 10, 12 feet off the ground, they're actually getting snapshots of what is beneath them. So when they see a flower, they don't see a blur. They actually see the flower, so they can go directly to that floral source and be very accurate. Um, so that answers that question?
Yes.
No
Somebody.
problem. You should be excited. You should say, "Oh yeah, um, yeah." Hopefully, I like to encourage people and tell them, if the bees chose you, and really that's what they're doing, they're choosing you because your yard is not as well managed as some people like. So they need a little poorer lawn. They need little gaps in the grass that show bare dirt, just little ones, not very big. Let's see if I go. So look at this here. It's thin. It's not just bare dirt. It's just thin grass. So the bees can get down. They can dig their holes. Um, if you have a super thick turf that you treat with pesticide, you have water it uh, every day, even today when it's raining, um, you're not going to have these ground nesting bees. But something where you have not the best quality lawn, that's what they like.
Hey, Mike,
Yeah.
there is another question. Someone's asking if there's anything we can do to protect the ground nests. Like, is it okay to mow over them? They're wondering how to protect them.
You actually can mow over them because the bees aren't stupid. They get out of the way of the mower. They're not going to sit there and get sucked up. So you can go ahead and mow over them, and you know it's okay. And if you, what we encourage people to do is if you have a spot in your yard that you can let not be the best grass, have some little bare spots. If we look over here, see these little bare patches in with the grass, little bare patches in with the grass. So you could still have a lawn, but if you give them, don't over fertilize it, don't overwater it, make it a little thinner, that's a habitat that you might draw in these native bees. And that's the thing with the native bees is you can't go buy a package of native bees. Well, you can if they're bumblebees. But all these ground nesters, they have to find your yard and they have to decide it's the right spot. So what's the best way to do that is to go back to the beginning and look at that list of plants. If you bring into your yard those plants and start planting them and plant them dense. Don't plant them like a landscaper where you have a couple feet between shrubs. Plant them dense. They like it dense. Being dense helps block a lot of the weeds, and being dense gives more floral resources for the bees. And the bees will come, and when they're in your yard, they'll go, oh, hey, there's a kind of a ratty patch of turf there. Maybe I should check that out for a home. So if you bring food in and then the bees will find your yard, and some of them will start nesting. And then once they start nesting, you'll get more. That's the thing with these. Interesting thing. These ground nesters, they tend to like aggregate like this. They don't really spread out quick into other yards very quickly. They're very slow to do that. Even though they're solitary and do all the work themselves, they like to do that work in an aggregate like this. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about stem nesters. So very similar in a life cycle to our ground nesters, but they nest in hollow stems, rotting wood, fascia boards along your roof line if they're unpainted and exposed. And they tunnel into these. And let's take a look. So this is what they're doing. They're they're making these series of chambers inside the stem or inside the wood. And this is, remember, this is one queen that is doing all this work by herself. So she doesn't really want to have to fly very far to the food source. So again, we just talked about planting good food source in your yard. So if you have great food source, you're going to attract these native nesters because they don't have to fly very far in your yard if they find the suitable habitat. But look at this. She's making, this is a mason bee, so she's making for one cell 15 to 40 forager trips. And during those trips, she's probably visiting an average of 75 flowers. And then she has to repeat to go out and collect mud to make the wall that's going to separate the chambers. And I want you to notice down at the bottom, I have males and females. So the opening is where it says mud cap on the right. So the females are as far back in this stem or chamber as she can get them. And she makes 3 or 4 females, and then the second half is all males. The reason for that is if a predator gets in through the mud cap and starts making its way down, it eats the males first, and it gives the females a better chance to survive because the females are more important than the males. The females are going to make new colonies. The males are just going to, they're just going to breed once and then die. And there's lots of males out there. So they protect the females, developing females, by putting them all the way in the back. And you might ask yourself, okay, so if you lay that female all the way in the back first, and then you lay these other ones, what happens when that female in the back hatches out and then she's got all these chambers ahead of her? Well, somehow they wait until it's their turn to hatch out and they move out. So they know it. The males develop quicker. You can see there's less food for the males. They develop quicker and they're out of there. And then the females can slowly follow. And this is a great picture because not all the native bees make their stem nesters make their nests the same. So look at the top. That's a leaf cutter bee, and it actually goes out and cuts these notches out of leaves, brings them back, and wraps up the chamber for its young. And it's kind of like they wrap they're like little bits of cigar where they wrap them up in these leaves. And then they hatch out just like if it was a mud chamber. In the center, that's a resin bee, and they actually create the dividing walls with resins from shrubs and trees. And then down at the bottom, we have the mason bee, which uses the mud dividers. And here's some great pictures of leafcutter bees cutting out. They make these beautiful, nice, sharp cuts in the leaves. And look at that. They fold it in half, and then they carry it back in between their legs back to the nest. Tremendous amount of work for these girls. This is just showing you, you've probably seen these around. These are fairly popular managed stem nesting sites. So you can either, the bottom right shows blocks of wood where they've drilled holes into it, small holes, 6 inches deep, to allow the bees nesting sites. The bamboo tubes, what else? The elderberry has hollow stems. Anything with hollow stems. Phragmites, you can make these tubes out of, or you can also get certain size just straws. They don't look too natural, but straws work as well. The bit of warning about putting in artificial nests like this is if you don't clean them out after the bees breed in them, you can build up disease in them. So then the next brood cycle, you would lose bees to disease. So now we're going to talk about the social bees. Bumblebees are social bees. In the East, we have about 26 different species. And all colonies are founded by a single queen. She's the only one that survives the winter. It'll be a newly mated queen in the fall. She finds a place to burrow down for the winter, survives the winter, and then goes and creates the colony. So bumblebees are annuals. They only last one season, and the nest can contain up to 300 workers. And they're a cavity nester, so they like to especially nest in old rodent burrows, brush piles, uh, tussocks, which are, the root structure of um, types of grasses, clumping types of grasses, and they will nest in tree cavities as well. So they need a cavity. They need some space because they're creating a lot of bees. So this is their life cycle. The hibernating queen hatches out in the spring, and she flies around, finds looking for not only food to feed herself and give herself energy, but a suitable nesting site, some place to have her colony. And when she finds that, then she starts creating these wax pots that contain a liquid mix of nectar and pollen. And in those pots, when she fills them up with that mix, and she lays her egg in there, which is going to be a fertilized egg in the spring, and it's going to develop into a worker. So once she starts laying, and now she has to keep going out to feed, to forage, to feed herself, to collect the pollen and nectar to make more of these little pots. So early springtime, she's trying to build up her workforce. She's trying to build up, raise a lot of worker females that are then, once she has enough, they'll go out and do the foraging, and she'll stay in the nest and, maintain the little wax pots and raise the young. Later on, about midsummer, she'll start laying unfertilized eggs, which will be raised into males. So workers are females, and they have 2 strands of DNA. Males only have 1 strand of DNA, and they don't do any work. They just breed with a virgin female. So in the fall, the males will leave the nest. They'll find a virgin female and mate with her. And once they mate, then they die. And then that newly mated queen will go off and find a place to overwinter. And the cycle will start over again in the spring. Here's a shot of a bumblebee nest in a rodent den. So you can see there's this loose aggregation of wax pots, not as structured as we'll see in the honeybee nest, but it gets the job done. And honeybees are exceptionally good pollinators. They do buzz pollinating, which is the only way you can pollinate really well. Tomatoes, they buzz pollinate blueberries, so they're actually a better pollinator of blueberries than honeybees are, because they do a better job. But their big trick is with certain flowers that have a very narrow tip, they can vibrate it and knock the pollen off. So now we're going to talk about honeybees. So again, there are single non-native bee species. They're from Europe. Highly social. They are called eusocial insects. They have a very evolved structure of social development. And it's a perennial colony, so they're not an annual. So if all goes well, if the colony doesn't die of disease or starve to death, it will live all year long. It will live throughout the winter and start up again, making bigger numbers in the springtime. They have a wax hive. The wax comb is what we're all familiar with, the honeycomb. And that's what they need to build, because that's where everything takes place. All the food storage and the brood rearing take place on the honeycomb. They're unique that they produce honey and store it, and that's what keeps them alive through the wintertime when there's no natural food out there. And in order to split their colony to make more colonies of bees, they swarm. And this is what we're looking at in this picture. This is a swarm that actually landed on this is about a 3.5 foot tall faucet out in the field. And the bees, somewhere in that mass of bees, there's a queen. And they are just waiting. Uh, this swarm cluster is the waiting stage after they've left the hive, and they're waiting for the scouts to come back and tell them where they're going to move to a permanent location. So under natural conditions, this is how honeybees build their combs. So they make these nice, relatively flat sheets. And this is what they store all their food and brood in. So the nice thing about this is that's what has enabled beekeepers to maintain bees in these nice hives. So we've taken, in the 1850s, Reverend Lorenzo Langstroth from Philadelphia, a local boy, figured out something we call bee space. Bees don't want to have more than 3/8 of an inch of space. That's the width that it takes for two bees to pass back to back with each other. And if it gets bigger than that, then they fill it up with comb. But in these boxes, we can put frames so that inset picture that shows a 10 frame box. And it has allowed us as beekeepers to actually pull out one frame at a time. We can look at the frame, we can determine the health of the bees, the health of the queen, are they laying properly? We check for diseases, and then we can put them back in with a minimal amount of disturbance. Before this type of hive, this is called a Langstroth hive. Before it was developed, the only way to go into a hive was to totally destroy the hive. Then you had to start new with new bees and have them build the hive all over again. So this is a huge development for beekeeping. And that mass of bees that's out on the front, that means it's hot inside. There's a lot of bees in this hive. It's probably July when this picture was taken. And so the bees will cluster out on the outside, and they'll open up more airspace for ventilation on the inside. Here we see in nature, honeybees would nest in a large cavity between 5 and 25 gallons with probably an optimal size in the 10 to 12 gallon range. And this is actually up at one of our hort farms on campus. It was pretty exciting tracking this through the season. And you could see our beekeeper with our about 12 gallon size container for her bees down at the bottom. So just to show you the queen honeybee, and if you didn't spot her, she's right there. Notice the extra long abdomen. She's the only one who should be laying eggs in the hive, and she has that extra long abdomen because she has a huge amount of ovaries and ovarials in her abdomen, and she's producing up to 1,500 to 2,000 eggs per day that she's laying. So she is a major egg laying machine. And what you see her standing on, this is called capped brood or sealed brood. So this is actually after 9 days, the open larvae secrete a pheromone that tells the bees they want to pupate and develop into an adult. And so the bees seal off the cap, the top of the cell, with wax. So here are the three different types of honeybees. The worker bee on the left, she's the smallest, but they make up about 85% of the bees in the hive. The middle bee is the male, also called a drone. They make up to 15% of the bees. And then there's typically one queen in the hive. And notice she's a lot longer. She's the longest, and we consider her the largest, although a lot of the males are really bulky and can be even bulkier than the queen. The males don't do anything. They except mate with a virgin queen. So they go out to fly once or twice a day looking for a virgin, and they come back and all they do is eat, and they don't help with defending the colony or with collecting food resources. They only exist to mate. Here we have a frame of brood. So we've pulled this out of the hive. This frame is typically going to be lower down. We like to keep them in the bottom part of the box. This is the brood chamber. And you can see they store honey up in the corners because they need to feed. And when the young brood emerges, it needs to feed right away. And so there's honey, and then between the honey and that capped brood, you will often find a row of pollen. And if we look here we'll see that here's our brood down here. And as you move out, you'll notice the brood gets younger and younger. So this is younger and younger brood. And then we have some eggs out here. You probably can't tell, but these little glow spots are eggs. And this is typically how they lay their brood. They'll lay them in a pattern like this. And as you move, to check the health, you want to see this open brood, the larvae, and you always want to look for eggs. If you see eggs, you know there's a queen in there somewhere. And here's the pollen that surrounds the brood, because once these young adults hatch out, they need to get protein. So the pollen is going to be their protein source, and they will eat protein for about 10 to 12 days. That develops glands in the head and their body and their muscles. And then the honey is right above them because they also need that carbohydrate source. Adults, once they get after an age of 12 days, probably eat little or no pollen anymore. That's all saved for the brood. So when we talk about, threats to the pollinators and the bees, a huge advantage of the honeybee is that they have beekeepers to manage them. So while with the exception of bumblebees, that they do a small amount of culturing, and they set out tubes to collect mason bees, and so they can collect some of those. None of the other native bees can we produce new queens. However, we can produce unlimited amount of honeybee queens. So here we show the beekeeper who has successfully grafted, and these queens developed, and they are now, in fact, this day, she was moving them into what we call mating nukes. So small nucleus hives that they'll hatch out into, and then hopefully they'll go out and mate and successfully return without being eaten by a dragonfly or a bird and start a new colony. So now let's talk about an important part of the life of the honeybees is collecting honey. So not only is it important to humans because we kind of think about it as, what we want out of it, but the bees need the honey to survive. Uh, this is a beautiful frame, pure honey that the bees have. It's coated with wax coating that keeps it from sucking in moisture from the air. So the bees dry the honey, the nectar. When they collect the nectar, it's roughly up to 79% water. So they have to dry it out after they get it back to the hive. And they want to dry it down to roughly under 18% moisture. And once they do that, then they cap it so that no moisture can get in there and spoil it. Because if moisture gets in there, it'll ferment and ruin the honey. So this is a beautiful frame. So remember, as a beekeeper, you always have to remember to leave enough honey for your bees to survive the winter. And in our area, we need to leave at least 60 pounds. We want them to go into winter with 60 pounds of honey to feed off of over the winter. So we have, so as a beekeeper, if we have extra honey, that's what we can take for ourselves. And we need to remove it from the hive, and we need to be very quick and about it, because when you pull honey out of a hive, you get a lot of friends and they follow you everywhere over to the car, and they'll follow the car for a while. So you need to have a insect-free area, space that you can extract your honey in. So we bring it into a room, and we like to have it warm. We like to have it above 80 degrees so the honey will flow better when we're doing our extraction process. And all that effort the bees went through to put that wax on to protect their honey, we now have to take off so that we can extract it. So there are various tools, knives, capping scratchers. The knives, you could be a hot knife or a cold knife. So there are a variety of tools, and usually all beekeepers find the tool that they prefer. So we take our cappings off, we save them because we can use that wax. And then we put our honey in an extractor, and that extractor we spin the frames, and by centrifugal force, that forces the honey out against the wall of the tank, and it drains down to the bottom. And you see that white valve at the bottom. When we do our extraction, we're going to leave that open. And we're going to let that honey flow out as soon as it hits the bottom, because if it builds up in there, then it will slow down the spin of the extractor, and your honey won't get extracted properly. So the honey, it drains out, and you typically, so when most of us, I use 2 strainers, a coarse strainer to get the big chunks of wax, and then a slightly finer strainer. We use like a 600 micron. So when we say a finer strainer, that's, pretty small openings, smaller than window screen. And that filters the wax out, but then leaves pollen in the honey. And that's what a lot of people are very excited about. They want to get the raw honey. So this is raw honey. And notice, once we put it through our 2 filters, then we can bottle it. And that is pure raw honey. It hasn't been heated. The stuff that you get in the supermarkets, that's typically heated up to 140 degrees, and run through fine filters to get everything out of it. And that helps it to stay better on the shelf and without crystallizing, because all honey will crystallize. If it starts crystallizing on you, you just heat some water and you set the syrup, loosen the cap, set it in the hot water, and as it heats up, it will liquefy again. So for those of you who are interested in bees, if you haven't seen this book, this is an excellent book to add to your collection. It's just loaded with super great pictures, but it's got really good information on it about all the bees, about everything about them. This is like anyone interested in bees, you should go out and grab this book. One of the authors, Olivia Carroll, you can actually see some videos of her on YouTube. She's a great speaker. I believe she's from Ohio and talks about Midwestern bees. Okay, so I guess if anybody has any questions.
That was great, Mike. Thank you so much. We did get a lot of comments saying how great the pictures were and how good the talk was as well. So congratulations on that.
Okay.
We did get a question from some people asking about just the names of the plants that you mentioned at the beginning.
Okay.
That were good for honeybees.
Okay.
Good for bees, excuse me. So if you could either reiterate those names or get us a copy of your PowerPoint, that would be great.
Yeah, how about if I'll write down the names and send those to you if you want to, if you have the ability to send them out to folks?
Yes, I have their email, so we'll be able to do that.
Okay, good. That'll be a lot easier.
So there were a couple of questions that were just sent to the host, so you probably didn't see them, Steve. They were about the ground nesters. So one person asked, how deep down do the nests go? While another person asked about soil types, whether there are any that are not attractive for the ground nesters, and she was thinking of like clay soils. So one about soil and one about the depth.
So they're probably down, they'll go down at least a foot. So they'll be somewhere in between a foot, foot and a half. I guess they could go a little bit deeper, but probably in the 14 to 18 inch range is probably where the bulk of them are going to be. And then types of soil. So yeah, they're not going to like a clay soil. I mean, I can't get through a clay soil. So they're going to like something that's, a loamy soil is great. If it's sand, so, pine barren sand, I don't think they're going to like that because it's going to collapse on them. So something, any of the loamy type of soils that will hold together and allow them they'll coat the insides, but they need that tunnel to stay open, for a little while they're working on it.
And then another person started with a comment. She said, I have many bees this year because I have a lot of native plants. However, I have no ground nesting native bees, even though she has open spaces in her lawn. And so she's wondering why she doesn't have any.
Well, it could be because they're not ground nesters, that she's got stem nesters that are living in the plants and the shrubs and trees in her neighborhood. And also they might, the ground nesters might just not like her location, and they're nesting, just down the road. Like I say, it's hard to get them to spread out. in a neighborhood. So if they're in an area, they tend to, just hang out in that area, and new queens make new nests in that area. But you have a better chance of drawing them to your location if you have the food sources. So that's great. She's got the food sources, and um, maybe that at some point, maybe one of those queens will decide, that this is the spot in that yard and start. And once you get one, you'll get multiple ones.
One final question. Do different bees have different wing patterns? In other words, the lines that divide the wings.
Oh, sure. That's actually an important way to determine what the species is on some of the bees, especially when you're getting down the smaller ones and that are similar, might be the same species but a different genus. That's what a lot of the folks will be looking at, is the wing venation on it. And that book that I showed you, your backyard bees, they talk about that, and they talk about what this specific bee has, this type of veins in it, and this is what you look for. So if she's interested in that, then that would be a good book for her to pick up.
And we just got another question. Do bee hotels work? And this person wants to know your opinion on the bee hotels.
They actually do work. Now, it's not like they may not all fill up, but the bees, once they find them, they do work. They do use them. Probably one of the best things to do if you're interested in that is they sell things that are paper liners. So you can actually put a paper liner in, and then after the bees hatch out, you can pull that out and throw it away. So it's like cleaning out the hotel and, trying to keep disease out. Because that is something that folks worry about, is the bees getting disease and then spreading it around the local area. But yes, they do work. It's actually kind of neat.
Okay, that's all the questions I see, but a lot of really great comments saying thank you, awesome, great presentation, very informative. So everyone's really appreciative, and we are too, Mike. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, if you have another couple of minutes, Mike, there were 2 questions that popped up in the Q&A.
Okay.
One person just wanted to know where they could purchase your honey if it was available.
Yeah, actually, this is my wife's company, Working Girl Meadows, and they can send her an email. Actually, I'm kind of drawing a blank. If they send me an email, I'll forward it to her.
Okay.
And she has a nice website. They could Google Working Girls Meadows.
Yep.
And she has a little website there, and they can actually contact her through that.
Yep.
And look at the pretty wildflower pictures from Pineapple Nursery.
And somebody also asked, what is the approximate cost for a modest honey production setup, like for the hives and the equipment and everything?
Well, I didn't go into that, but beekeeping is not an inexpensive hobby. So at least for my pocketbook. So to set up your first hive, to get a hive and bees will probably run you around $400 initially, maybe more, maybe closer to $500. And then you're going to spend probably another $100 on equipment, getting yourself set up, at least $100. So I tell people your first hive is about $500, and then if you get if you want to build a second hive right away, where you have to purchase bees, that's going to be another probably $350, $400. So if you make for any hive that survives the winter, you can then split those hives into 2 or more hives and just get queens, mated queens for the new hives. So if that's why you want to be a good beekeeper and get your bees through the winter, because then you can really take off with the number of bees that you make if you want to go that way. But I have to tell you, it's quite a bit of effort and a lot of maintenance. And if you're interested in that, make sure you take a beginning beekeeping class before you go out and purchase everything.
Well, that's a nice segue, because I was going to mention that you are going to be doing an online beekeeping class in November. So if
Yes.
people are interested in finding out more information on the honeybee and beekeeping side of it, they can get more information. Just go to rutgers.edu and search for the beginner beekeeping class, and you'll get all the information on that, which is going to be I believe in November.
Yes. Yep.
So I believe we've covered all the questions and stuff. So thank you again, Mike, for everything. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you everyone for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. Our next webinar in the series will be if you plant it, they will come, which will deal with planting native plants to deal with invasive plants, and also the dreaded white-tailed deer. So that will be next Tuesday, the 18th of August at 7 p.m. So if you haven't registered for it yet, please do so, and please let your friends know about these webinars. We're really excited to present them to you, and really glad you came. So thank you all, everyone, for coming tonight.
All right.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye.
You're still